All right, so we're in the little book of Jonah. I don't remember it, I might have, but for some of the older ones in here in Sunday school, the old flannel boards, remember those in Sunday school? I think I had that, but anyway, I heard somebody talking about that. Jonah and the whale on the flannel board, but I don't remember that. So what we saw was Jonah is God's prophet. God's called him. He's living large, if you will, there in Israel. He's got a great ministry going on. People respect him. People love him. He loves the people. He loves his ministry. And the word of God comes to him one day and says, I want you to go to Nineveh. And that upset his world. And so Jonah decided, instead of going to Tarshish, which is over near Spain, it was probably the most known furthest west city at that particular time. Well, Nineveh was east. He was going to go as far as he could go, or he thought he was going to go as far as he could go. And what we see is that he goes down to the harbor, he finds this ship, and being a human being that he is, he may have looked at that and said, well, God's not all that upset then if there's a ship right here and it happens to be going for Tarshish, right? But what he doesn't know is that God's not going to let him get away. And so he gets on this ship, and very quickly God sends this storm, and it's such a violent storm that even these sailors on this ship, who no doubt were experienced, if they were going to sail that far, they'd done it before, but it scared even them. And that must have been some kind of storm. I've seen documentaries and other shows where you see these large ships in the ocean, and they run out and into these storms, and some of these waves will be 120 feet high. And you just watch this ship ride up over that wave and slam down the other side. And to me, I imagine that that's similar to what they were experiencing here, except they're in a little wooden boat instead of this large ocean-going liner. And so the sailors are so scared they start to ditch everything over the side. They're trying to keep the boat going. But then when we see Jonah, he's down in the bottom of the ship. He's sleeping safe and sound. As we go through this story, what we will see is there are numerous parallels to Jesus in this. If you remember with the apostles, they get into the storm in the sea, and Jonah's experiencing this storm because of his disobedience. The disciples experienced a storm because of their obedience. And when you read about that in Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, what you see is Jesus teaches them these three parables about faith. And I can just imagine them sitting there, they're on dry land, it's calm, they're listening to these parables and they're going, yep, I got faith, I got faith. And then the test came. Jesus said, I want you to cross, we're going to cross over to the other side. And so he sends a storm, and after he stills the storm, he immediately turns around to him and he said, where's your faith? So because of their obedience, it was a great test for them. For Jonah, because of his disobedience, this is how God's going to break him and change his heart, change his mind. So what we see here, they're casting lots. They believed in their own gods, and so they knew that some God was in charge of this particular storm, that it didn't just come up by accident. And so they're trying to appease whatever God that they can appease. And so they cast lots, and the lots fall on Jonah. And so they go wake him up, and they're like, hey, you're the guy, tell us who you are. So what we see here beginning in chapter 1, verse 8, this crew, they begin to ask Jonah lots of questions. Then they said to him, tell us now, on whose account has this calamity struck us? What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? And he said to them, I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. This is a man that he had basically given up his ministry, at least in his mind. And he had decided, I think, that if I'm going to go to Tarshish and I'm not going to obey God, he's not going to minister through me anymore. And we see that that's not true. Jonah, in this very account, in the storm itself, he tells him exactly who was responsible for that storm. He knows. And so he tells him who the true God of the Bible is. So what they want to know about this God that Jonah's running from, and so he tells them. And if you notice here, when his sin is exposed, this disobedience to God, all of a sudden his silence is broken and he begins to speak now. And so he's able to tell the crew about God. He tells them he's the God of heaven and he created earth. And so we know that God rules over the winds, he rules over the waves, and he also will expose his rebellious servants. And so now these guys, once Jonah tells him that, now the storm begins to make sense. They're like, okay, there is someone who was responsible for this. It's not any of our gods. And an amazing thing that we'll see as we go through this too is that these men on these ships, these pagans, were converted. And it was because of what Jonah had told them and what God actually does. We'll see that as we go along too. And so they see, he tells them who brought the storm, and immediately in verse 10 what we see is these men become very frightened and they're trying to appease God. How do we appease God? Then the men became extremely frightened and they said to him, how could you do this? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. So they said to him, what should we do to you that the sea may become calm for us? For the sea was becoming increasingly stormy. They were scared in the first place because of the storm. The storm's really winding up intensity. And so they were extremely scared. Verse 12, and he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that on account of me, this great storm has come upon you. How do you think Jonah knew the solution? How do you think he came up with that? God told him. At some point, God told him, because no way would you have wanted to have been in that water under any circumstances. And so it's apparent that God told him, look, they need to throw you out of the boat and I'll calm the storm. And so that's what he tells the men. And so again, just like when Jonah's sin was exposed and his silence was ended, God's silence is ended now. And so Jonah becomes this prophet again, telling the crew what they have to do to be saved, and that change was immediate. Now in 13, what we see here is self-reliance, human effort, and we see it even today. Verse 13, however, the men rowed desperately to return to land, but they couldn't, for the sea was becoming even stormier against them. God sends this storm, he's going to break Jonah, and he tells Jonah, tell them to pick you up and throw you overboard. These men didn't want to kill Jonah. And so what do? They rely on their own efforts to begin to row. But in doing so, they were disobeying God, because God had told Jonah what to do. Jonah tells them what to do, and they say, no, we'll do it ourselves, thank you very much. Do we see that today? All too often. I know all too often I can be guilty of that too. And so these men think that they can save themselves by their own effort. Also, we see this if you talk to someone today about Christ and it's all about faith in Jesus. I've heard this too. Well, if I just obey the 10 Commandments, then hopefully when I get there, then I'll be graded. Does God grade on a curve? Nope. Not at all. And for someone that tells me, well, if I just keep the 10 Commandments, my next question to them is, there are 613 commandments. Are you going to keep them all? And if you miss one of them, what are you going to do? Because you just violated the law, right? So it's almost human nature to say, no, I'll get there on my own. I'll get there by myself. Thank you very much. And so these men are no different. They believe they can survive this storm without this sacrifice. And again, it points to Jesus to say that salvation has come through his sacrifice. And so these men are going to be saved by sacrificing Jonah. They're not sure of this yet. And getting back to this human effort type thing, I'm sure you've all heard that poem Invictus. You've at least heard part of it. And I'm going to read just a couple lines out of it. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I think whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That is pure human effort. And as I was looking that particular poem up, it reminded me, who was the guy, I cannot remember his name, responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing? Remember that? Timothy McVeigh. When they executed him, when he was on the table and they asked him if he had any last words to say, he recited this poem. He thought he was in control of things. But it sounds great, it sounds very positive, self-exalting, all that kind of stuff. But it also demonstrates an extraordinary resistance to God. And so it's the polar opposite of a God-centered life, and that's what these men were demonstrating. No, we're going to row, we're going to do it ourselves. We don't need that sacrifice. If you look in verse 13, those 4 words, but they could not. And this is the turning point of the story. When they finally realize we can't do this on our own. And so they turn to, out of desperation, they turn to do what Jonah had said to do. And again, this points us to Jesus. God's storm is always, his storm and his judgment is always stronger than we are, right? And if God's going to break a person, he's going to have quite the storm and quite the judgment. And as we see here in Jonah, the storm starts out, but the more resistant everyone's starting to get, the intensity of the storm starts to ramp up. And God will do the same thing in a person's life today. If he's put his hand on that particular person and says, that one's mine, he's going to keep ramping it up until finally there's a breaking point, and they begin to change. And so, we don't have the ability within us to get ourselves to heaven. There's absolutely nothing that we can offer. And so it's this sacrifice that's absolutely necessary. And for us as believers, we know that Jesus gave his life to deliver us from God's judgment against our sin. And we see the parallel here that Jesus too, he was cast out by men. He was forsaken by the Father. He offered himself as that sacrifice. And it's the very heart of the gospel. It's about this storm, this judgment that's coming. And Christ's sacrifice to save us out of that. And so he was thrown into that storm of God's judgment so that we would never have to taste that or experience that. And that is just a fantastic, almost unbelievable thing, is it not? To a natural person to think that one person paid our sin debt and now we're free. That is stunning. Verse 14. Then they cried on the Lord and said, Then they called on the Lord and said, We earnestly pray, O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, and do not put innocent blood on us. For you, O Lord, have done as you have pleased. And when the ship's crew finally saw that this religion, if you will, that they'd been pursuing, number one, they realized their gods were nothing but false gods. And number two, they realized that there really is a true living God, and humanly they can't do anything to change that situation. They're in the middle of this storm. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and they realize very quickly that finding peace with God was the only thing that mattered. The beautiful thing for us as Christians, Romans 5:1 says, we have peace with God. That is stunning. And so the crew asked God for mercy. They didn't want to kill him, but they knew that was something that they had to do. Jonah hadn't done anything to them. He hadn't wronged them in any way, and they didn't want to risk his life. But they knew too that God had said, into the ocean he's going to go. Verse 15. So they picked up Jonah, threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. Immediately threw him over, realized he's the sacrifice that pleased God. And all of a sudden, this storm is done. They're saved, and realizing that God saved them, they wanted to know all about who this God is. And in the middle of this storm, they come to this realization of who God is. And their lives, Scripture doesn't tell us, but I can't imagine that their lives were ever the same again. You look here in verse 16, then the men feared the Lord greatly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. They're sold out at that point. I can't see them ever going back to worship their gods. They knew God himself. Now, this book of Jonah here, what we see is the story of a mature believer. And again, most scholars think he wrote this much later in his life as he looked back on it. You ever gone through an experience, a traumatic experience, and as you think back on it, you can remember the sights, the sounds, the smells, sensations, all of that kind of stuff? That's what I think this was for Jonah. He was very aware, and it was easy for him to remember what those sensations, those sights, those smells, those sounds, as he tells this particular story. There's this great transformation we're going to see here that takes place when Jonah's in the water. What we see is that God finally broke through all the barriers that Jonah had put up. Barriers that had put him into despair, if you will. It's like, I'm not going to Nineveh, I'm going to Tarshish. I've got no more ministry, I've got no more hope. And so, in the water, what we see here is he begins to have this hope again. And he begins to know, okay, God, you are in charge. You have your hand on my life. And so this prophet that had stopped praying, had stopped prophesying, had stopped praying, all of a sudden he turns back to prayer again. For the sailors, their trial is over. That storm's done. They're going to make it safely. It's over. For Jonah, he's still in the middle of this. God's still got some things he wants to teach him. What we see here in chapter 2, verse 1, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the stomach of the fish. And as he prays, as he says his prayer, what he's remembering is what happened to him from the time he hit the water to the time that fish took him. You can imagine when Jonah first hits the water, I don't know if he could swim or not, but I imagine he was doing everything he could to keep his head above the water. To me, drowning would be one of the worst ways to die. Just suffocated. And certainly this man didn't want to die. But what we see here is these currents keep pulling him under, keep dragging him down, if you will. And so you imagine he's bobbing up and down. He's trying to get air. When he hits the top, the current pulls him back down again. And then when he comes up again to get a breath, now this wave comes over the top of him, and so he just can't quite catch a breath. And so it's not long. Physically, he's fatigued. He can't do it anymore, and he has no choice. He's going to drown, and he's convinced he's going to drown. And what we see here is this great prayer. I'll read from verse 2 through verse 6. I called out of my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I cried for help from the depth of Sheol. You did hear my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current engulfed me. All your breakers and billows passed over me. So I said, I've been expelled from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the very soul. The great deep engulfed me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I descended to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord, my God. God took him all the way to the bottom of the ocean before that fish got him. And you can just imagine he's at that point where he thinks this is all over, and immediately turns to God and begins to pray. And in verse 4, where he says, "Nevertheless, I will look again towards your holy temple." He's being broken, but he knows where to look, and so he's got that hope. God took him to the bottom where basically Jonah had no more way out. He couldn't swim to the top. He didn't have any more strength. And so when he was at that lowest point where he could do absolutely nothing, he realized there's only one place to look. And that happens, has happened for us as believers. We finally get to that point where we realize there's no other option, right? There's none. Can't do it in our own strength. God's in control. And then what we see is this pounding that God's putting him through. You know, Jonah had this resentment built up in him. Sometimes, depending on how thick that resentment is as to how hard the process of the breaking has to be, or how intense. And for Jonah, it was extremely intense. And so God has to take him to the bottom of the ocean where he thinks he's done. It's over. But what he doesn't know is that God has this great plan for him. Jonah thinks that everything, his future's done for, his life is over with, and it's done. And God's saying, no. I have a purpose for you. I want to break you because you're my man. And if it hadn't been this great future that he's going to have, if it hadn't been for the storm, if it hadn't been for the casting of lots and the pounding waves, it couldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened. Because he was determined he was going to go to Tarshish. He was done. And so these were all the means that Jonah was brought to a place where finally, at last, he cries out to God. And what we see here in this prayer, in the process of getting to this prayer, there's always three dynamics at play, if you will, when it comes to prayer. The first one is an awakening, and we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. And then there's a believing, and then there's a repenting. And those are always there. And when you take away any of those, if you're not aware of God, why would you pray? If you're aware that there is a God, but you don't believe in him, why would you pray? And without any one of those three, it's kind of like a fire. You got to have oxygen, you got to have a source, and then you got to have a supply, right? You take any one of those away, and the fire goes out. It can't exist. And so Jonah had lost this ability, not the ability to pray, the desire to pray, I'll say it that way. He'd become this very discontented believer. He had his own agenda for life. But God showed him otherwise, right? God's in control. So when we look at each one of these three things, we see this awakening, and this is brought about in verse 3 of chapter 2. For you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current engulfed me. All your breakers and billows passed over me. Jonah's sleeping on the boat, which is a symptom of his lethargy, if you will, that had just come over his entire inner life. He was just done. He was tired. And you know, one time he had walked with God. He remembered that. But he forgot who he was. Something had happened in his heart when God told him, I want you to go to Nineveh. And there's, you know, as we read through this, I have to tell myself, slow down. Some things are taking longer than what we read in Scripture. Does that make sense? So you say, like in verse 1, the word of the Lord comes to him. In verse 2, tells him where to go. In verse 3, but Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish. I don't think that was an immediate thing. I think he had to sit around and think about this. Do I really want to go to Nineveh? Do I really want to do that? Give up everything? So I think there's this period of time. And it was enough time that his heart really became hard. He resented God. I can imagine when God first called him to be a prophet. I'll do anything you want. Anytime you want, you say the word and I'll do it. To now, he's at this point where now he's got his own terms and his own conditions. Sometimes we do that too, don't we? We have our own terms and conditions. And there were limits to what he was willing to do. He was not willing to go to Nineveh. And so, in my mind, you see this eager young prophet who's eager to do what God says do, and God really blessed him, to this older prophet who through time had gotten used to the way things were and kind of maybe not even said it or thought it necessarily, but certainly through his actions he had set his limits. This is my home territory, and I'm not going to leave here. But God has other plans too. And we see this today in some people, this spiritual decline. Many times, most of the time I think, is this gradual, steady decline. It's not this sudden drop. It's just a gradual, steady decline. Worship becomes distant. Prayer becomes repetitive, right? If you're going to church, maybe the Lord's table becomes just part of the service. You come, you hear the word becomes routine, and then your life just kind of runs on automatic pilot, and you're no longer engaged. And remember that the Christian life is a relationship with God. I can tell you, for example, if my attitude towards my marriage were kind of treated in that same way along those patterns, how long do you think I'd be married? Not very long, right? My wife would get rid of me. And we need to think about that's what our relationship with God is. He wants that relationship with his children, with his people. We've seen the sad stories of children who distance themselves from their parents, and that relationship is fractured. And God wants that relationship with us. Jonah's reaction, it could have gone the opposite direction, right? He knows in the middle of this storm that God's in control, that God brought this storm, that God's got other plans for him. He knows that. What's the alternative direction he could have gone? God, I can't believe you're frustrating my plans to go to Tarshish. I cannot believe that you would do that. Do you even love me? Do you even care? We've seen that in some people too, where there's a trial in their life, and instead of stepping back and saying, what can I learn from this? Or what does God want to teach me through this? Becoming very resentful, saying, I can't believe that God wouldn't listen to my prayer, wouldn't do what I told him to do. And Jonah definitely didn't go in that direction. We see that in verse 3. Jonah finally sees what's going on here. God is actually working in his life, working through these things. He's going to bring him to where he wants him to be. He could have easily blamed the crew, but again, I think he knew the reason he had to go into the water was because God told him. So he couldn't blame the crew. He knew it was God all along. He knew it was God's winds and God's waves, and those were the ones that pulled him down. Jonah knew that God was making this intervention in his life. And recognizing this, that seeing God's hand in the middle of these painful experiences, it brings about this genuine change in his heart. God had broken that crust of resentment off of his heart. Prior to this, he gets on the boat, he goes right to sleep. He's not worried. He's thinking, I'm heading out of here. God doesn't need me anymore. God doesn't care. And so he goes sound asleep. Now, I guarantee he's wide awake. He had felt God's presence and his absolute power. And so what had become very vague and very distant and very routine for him, now all of a sudden this relationship with God, it's awake. It's alive. It's fresh for him again. And we see this in his prayer. He is openly confessing to God. He doesn't come with an agenda. He doesn't come saying, oh, poor me. He doesn't come with a complaint. He says, God, honestly, this is what I've done. I know I've done wrong, and I know that you're in control of this, and turns things back over to God. So we see this awakening that brings about this prayer. The second thing is the believing, this battle for faith in Jesus Christ. Verse 4, so I said, I've been expelled, or some versions may say banished, from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. And again, remember, this prayer, this battle that's going on in his soul, was he in the fish or was he in the water? He's in the water, right? What do you think might have happened had the fish taken him as soon as he hit the water?
Struggle.
Yeah, I don't think we would have seen the change of heart that we see. And God knew that. God's like, fish is coming, salvation's coming, but first I need to take you down. And so when he prays this prayer, or tells us about this prayer, he's actually praying this in the water. And if you can imagine, he's at the bottom of the ocean. He's just about out of oxygen entirely. And he says, yet again, I'm going to look towards your holy temple. This belief that he has. So it's in the water where he says this. We see in verses 4 through 5, we know he's in the water because seaweed is starting to wrap around his head. Seaweed lives near the bottom. And it says he was sinking to the roots of the mountains. I don't know how deep that was, but in parts, especially the Pacific Ocean, there are mountains rising from the bottom of the ocean that are as tall, if not taller, than Mount Everest. That is stunning. Mount Everest is 29,000 feet, I think. And you've got mountains that from the bottom of the ocean that are even over that. So this guy's deep, very deep. And again, we see in verse 2 that it was out of this place where he had calls to God to help him there. When he's in the water, he's absolutely sure that he's going to die. He's convinced of it. When he's in the fish, he's absolutely convinced that he's going to live. He knows that God has saved him. This belly of the fish, this wasn't a place of trauma for Jonah. This was a place of deliverance. And so he knew that once he was delivered, that God had done that. Now he's out of danger, and now he can really worship the Lord. And we'll see that when he's in the belly of the fish is when he really looks back on these events that have gone on, and he just marvels at the fact that God heard him, number one, but number two, God saved him. And I got to think after this, it changed him in ways that he would never go back to being the same way he was. He says in verse 4 here, I've been banished. He felt like he was beyond forgiveness and hope. But in the water, there's also this battle that's raging in his soul. It says in the second part of verse 4. So what we see here is this, the first one, I've been expelled from your sight. He feels like he's unforgivable, he's hopeless, there's nothing to do at this point, but yet, in the very next sentence, he says, yet I will look toward your holy temple. That's a sign of faith. And that's a contradiction of what he just said. Oftentimes, our flesh, it can be, those are hard battles, aren't they? All the time. Because what will your flesh do? Will it tell you the truth or tell you a lie? Tell you a lie, right? So in the times where we want to pray, but we feel like it's just absolutely impossible. Our flesh is going to tell us it's either a flesh or it's going to be Satan. One of the two is going to tell us God's against you, and what you just did, you've gone too far, and now God is not going to forgive you. Flesh is a liar, and our faith defies our flesh. It defies these lies. And for the believer, in those times where your flesh tells you, or Satan tells you, who do you think you are? How can you be a Christian after you've done those kinds of things? It's our faith that brings us back, points us toward God and say, you know, I'm helpless. Without you, I'm absolutely helpless. And so Jonah, he doesn't find it easy to trust God when he's down in the water. But he had to remember these promises of God. I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to preach to this great city. That was a promise. God was telling him, you're going to do this. You know, I want you to do this. I don't need you to do this, but I want you to do this. And it was a great promise from God. You know, for the Christian, we talk, and it is, we talk about the step of faith being a small step, right? How hard is that step sometimes? Very hard, right? We've got certain enemies that we have to overcome. And so, you know, don't be surprised at times if your faith, that struggle that you go through, that we'll all go through and do all go through, sometimes will feel like the fight of your life. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, you know, this faith prevails over despair when we fix our eyes on the grace of God. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, you know, we're told to fix our eyes on Jesus. To get through this race called life, we have to fix our eyes toward Jesus. Jonah looked at himself, he despaired because he knew that he deserved to be banished. And it's just like the lies that Satan tells us that, you know, how can you be a Christian? And if we listen to that, it's not long before we begin to agree and go, yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. But we need to get our eyes on Jesus. In verse 4, what we see here, where he talks about looking towards the holy temple, he says, look. And really, that is a way of describing faith. And this goes all the way back to the book of Numbers in chapter 21. Remember the children of Israel? God sends these poisonous snakes, and people are getting bit. People are dying, and they're crying out to Moses, tell us what to do. Ask God what we can do. What did God tell Moses to do? Make a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, and tell the people to look. That's faith. All right, any questions, comments?